Detective Rachel Turner had been working for the CIA for almost 8 years now. At 34, she looked like any other woman walking down the street. Today she wore simple jeans, white sneakers, and a gray hoodie. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would make anyone look twice. But Rachel wasn't just any woman. She was one of the best undercover agents the CIA had. Her specialty was tracking down people who helped terrorists get money. These weren't the big scary guys you see in movies. They were quiet people who moved money around, helped bad guys buy things they needed, and made sure terrorist groups could keep doing their dirty work. Today had started like any other Tuesday. Rachel met with someone at a small coffee shop downtown. The person looked nervous, kept checking their phone, and spoke in whispers even though the place was nearly empty. They handed her a small piece of paper with some numbers written on it. Bank account numbers. The kind that could lead to some very dangerous people. Rachel thanked them, paid for both their coffees, and left through the back door like they had planned. She walked 3 blocks before calling for a ride on her phone. While waiting, she decided to take a quick look around the area. Sometimes the best intelligence came from just watching and listening. That's when she saw something interesting. Across the street, there was a tall glass building with lots of offices inside. Nothing unusual about that in this part of the city. But what caught her eye were the 3 men standing outside the building's entrance. They weren't dressed like office workers. They wore expensive suits but carried themselves differently. One kept looking at his watch. Another was on his phone speaking in what sounded like Arabic. Rachel pulled out her phone and pretended to check messages while actually taking pictures. The CIA had been watching this building for weeks. They thought it might be connected to a group that was helping terrorists move money through fake businesses. If these men were who she thought they were, those photos could be very valuable. She moved closer, trying to get better shots without being obvious about it. The 3rd man noticed her and said something to his friends. They all looked in her direction. Rachel quickly put her phone away and started walking toward the corner where her ride was supposed to pick her up. But the men kept watching her. One of them pulled out his phone and made a call. Rachel felt her stomach tighten. Had she been too obvious? In her line of work, being noticed was never good. She reached the corner and checked her ride app. Her driver was still 5 minutes away. The men across the street were still there, and now they seemed to be having an intense conversation. One pointed in her direction. Rachel tried to stay calm. Maybe they hadn't figured out what she was doing. Maybe they just thought she was some random woman taking selfies. But her training kicked in and she started planning escape routes just in case. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw 2 police officers walking toward her. One was older, probably in his 40s, with gray at his temples and the confident walk of someone who'd been doing this job for a long time. The other looked younger, maybe late 20s, with eager eyes and perfect posture. "Excuse me, miss," the older officer said. "We got a call about someone acting suspicious in this area. Taking pictures of buildings, watching people. You know anything about that?" Rachel's heart started beating faster, but she kept her face neutral. This was bad, very bad. She couldn't let them search her bag because it was full of things that would be hard to explain. Hidden cameras, listening devices, encrypted phones, and other equipment that definitely didn't belong to a regular person. "I'm just waiting for my ride," she said, showing them her phone with the ride app open. "I was taking some pictures of the buildings. They're pretty." The younger officer looked around at the boring glass and concrete structures. "Pretty?" he asked like he didn't believe her. "I'm studying architecture," Rachel lied smoothly. "I like to photograph different building styles for my classes." The older officer, whose name tag read Detective Wilson, didn't look convinced. "What school?" Rachel named a local community college. She'd done her homework on cover stories like this. "I'm working on my associate degree part-time. Mind if we take a look at those pictures?" Detective Wilson asked. This was getting complicated. Rachel had taken photos of the building, but she'd also taken pictures of the 3 men. If the police saw those, they might ask questions she couldn't answer without blowing her cover. "Sure," she said, hoping to seem cooperative. She opened her photo app but made sure to only show them pictures of buildings from earlier in the day. She'd learned to keep different types of photos in separate folders for situations exactly like this. The younger officer, whose badge said Officer Hayes, looked at the pictures and shrugged. "Looks like buildings to me." But Detective Wilson wasn't satisfied. "The call we got said someone was watching people, taking pictures of individuals without their permission. That's different from photographing architecture. Rachel felt a drop of sweat roll down her back despite the cool weather. I don't know what to tell you, officer. I was just taking pictures of buildings while waiting for my ride. What's in the bag? Officer Hayes asked, pointing to her designer handbag. Just normal stuff. Wallet, keys, makeup, you know. Mind if we take a look? This was the moment Rachel had been dreading. She couldn't say no without seeming suspicious, but she couldn't let them search her bag without risking everything. Inside that bag were items worth more than most people made in a year. Tiny cameras disguised as makeup compacts, listening devices that looked like breath mints, and a small vial of liquid that could neutralize certain chemical weapons. Is that really necessary? She asked. I haven't done anything wrong. Detective Wilson stepped closer. Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Someone called in suspicious activity and we need to check it out. The more you cooperate, the faster this goes. Rachel looked around. A few people were starting to notice the interaction. Some were slowing down as they walked past, curious about what was happening. Others were pulling out their phones. She knew she had to make a decision fast. Refuse the search and look guilty, or let them look and risk exposing classified government equipment. Either choice could end her career or worse. Okay, she said finally, but can we do this somewhere more private? People are staring. Right here is fine, Detective Wilson said. We're not hiding anything, are we? Rachel handed over her bag, silently hoping that the disguised equipment would actually look like what it was supposed to be. The CIA's tech people were good, but would they be good enough to fool experienced police officers? As Detective Wilson opened her bag and started looking through it, Rachel noticed that one of the men from across the street was now walking in their direction. This situation was getting more complicated by the minute. Detective Wilson opened Rachel's handbag and started pulling things out one by one. He set each item on the hood of a nearby parked car, treating them like evidence in a crime scene. Rachel watched nervously as her carefully disguised equipment was exposed to daylight and curious onlookers. First came her wallet, normal-looking brown leather with credit cards and cash visible through the clear windows. Detective Wilson flipped through it quickly, checking her ID. Rachel Turner, he read aloud. Lives on Oak Street. The address was real. The CIA had set up that apartment 3 years ago as part of her cover identity. If anyone checked, they'd find utilities in her name, mail delivery, even neighbors who would swear she lived there quietly and kept to herself. Next, Officer Hayes pulled out what looked like a regular makeup compact. Shiny silver with a mirror inside, just like millions of women carried every day. But Rachel knew that compact contained a camera capable of taking photos clear enough to read documents from 30 feet away. The mirror was actually a one-way glass that hid the lens. Expensive makeup, Officer Hayes commented, turning the compact over in his hands. Rachel forced herself to smile. I save up for the good stuff. Detective Wilson continued digging through her bag. He found her keys, a pack of what looked like mint gum, and a small electronic device about the size of a deck of cards. Rachel's stomach dropped when she saw him pick up the device. What's this? Detective Wilson asked, holding it up. Portable speaker? Rachel answered quickly. For my phone, you know. I like to listen to music when I'm studying. The device actually was a listening tool that could pick up conversations from over 100 feet away. It looked enough like a small speaker that her story might work. But Rachel could see Detective Wilson turning it over, looking for buttons or ports that should be there. Doesn't have a power button, he observed. It's voice activated, Rachel said. You just say play music, and it connects to your phone through Bluetooth. Officer Hayes had moved on to examining a small white container that looked like breath mints. Rachel held her breath as he shook it, hearing the small tablets rattle inside. Those weren't mints. They were high-tech data storage devices, each one capable of holding enough information to fill a library. Want a mint? Officer Hayes asked with a grin, starting to open the container. They're prescription, Rachel said quickly. For my stomach problems. They don't taste very good. It wasn't a complete lie. The tablets would taste terrible if someone actually tried to eat one, and they might cause stomach problems too. But they were definitely not medicine. Detective Wilson found her phone charger, which actually was just a phone charger, and a small bottle that looked like hand sanitizer. Rachel's anxiety spiked again. The bottle contained a chemical compound that could neutralize certain biological weapons. It looked and felt like hand sanitizer, But if someone tested it in a lab, they'd discover it was something much more complex. People are really serious about staying clean these days, Detective Wilson commented, setting the bottle down with the other items. Can't be too careful, Rachel agreed, trying to keep her voice steady. A small crowd was starting to gather. People walking by were slowing down and some were obviously recording with their phones. Rachel noticed a woman across the street pointing at them and talking animatedly to someone on her phone. This was exactly what she didn't need. Videos of CIA agents being searched by local police was the kind of thing that ended careers and compromised operations, that officer. Hayes pulled out the last item from her bag. A small, glass vial with a clear liquid inside. Rachel's heart nearly stopped. That vial contained an antidote for a specific type of poison that certain terrorist groups were known to use. It was incredibly valuable and completely impossible to explain away. "What's this?" Officer Hayes asked, holding the vial up to the light. Rachel's mind raced. "Anxiety medication," she said. "Liquid form. My doctor prescribed it." "Doesn't have a label," Detective Wilson observed, taking the vial from his partner. "It's a special compound. The pharmacy puts it in plain bottles because it's light-sensitive. The label would just be a sticker that falls off anyway." Detective Wilson looked skeptical. "What's it called?" Rachel named a real anxiety medication that did sometimes come in liquid form. She'd memorized the names of dozens of common medications for situations exactly like this. "How much do you take?" Officer Hayes asked. "Just a few drops when I'm feeling really stressed. Like right now, actually." Detective Wilson called something in on his radio. Rachel couldn't hear everything, but she caught enough words to understand he was asking someone to look up information about her and the medication she'd claimed to have. The crowd was getting bigger. Rachel counted at least 15 people watching now, and several were definitely recording. She could see phone cameras pointed in their direction. Some people were talking loudly about police harassment and racial profiling. "This is ridiculous," a woman shouted from the sidewalk. "She's just standing here waiting for her ride." "Leave her alone," a man added. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Detective Wilson looked annoyed by the attention. "Everyone needs to move along. This is police business, but people weren't moving along. If anything, more were stopping to watch." Rachel realized this situation was spiraling out of control in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd trained for interrogations, for cover stories, for equipment failures, but she hadn't really prepared for dealing with social media and viral videos. Officer Hayes was now examining her bag itself, feeling around the lining for hidden pockets or compartments. There weren't any. The CIA had learned long ago that hidden compartments just made agents look more suspicious if they were caught. "Everything seems normal," he told his partner. But Detective Wilson wasn't satisfied. Something about the situation bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the expensive equipment or the way Rachel answered questions just a little too smoothly, or the fact that she seemed too calm for someone being searched by police. He picked up the small electronic device again. "Show me how this speaker works." Rachel's palms started sweating. The device wasn't actually a speaker and she couldn't make it play music. But she had to try something. "My phone's battery is low," she said. "That's why I was waiting for my ride instead of walking. I don't think it has enough power to connect." "Try anyway." Rachel pulled out her phone and pretended to search for Bluetooth settings. She tapped around randomly, hoping to buy time while she figured out what to do next. The device in Detective Wilson's hands was worth about $50,000 and contained technology that most governments would kill to get their hands on. "It's not finding the speaker," she said after a minute of fake searching. "Sometimes it takes a while to connect." Detective Wilson's radio crackled with a response to his earlier call. Rachel heard fragments. "No record of prescription, address checks out, and no outstanding warrants." The fact that there was no record of her prescription wasn't necessarily suspicious. Lots of people got prescriptions that weren't in the main database systems, especially for specialized medications. But Rachel could see Detective Wilson processing this information, along with everything else that seemed slightly off about her story. Officer Hayes was looking at the crowd, which had grown to about 20 people now. Some were getting loud, shouting things like harassment and profiling. Others were just filming silently. But Rachel knew those videos were probably already being uploaded to social media. "We should probably wrap this up," Officer Hayes said quietly to his partner. But Detective Wilson shook his head. "Something's not right here. Look at this stuff." He gestured to the items spread across the car hood. Expensive bag, high-end makeup, fancy electronics. But she says she's a part-time student taking architecture classes. Rachel's cover story was starting to fall apart under scrutiny. She'd been too focused on hiding her real equipment and not focused enough on making her fake identity completely believable. Some students have jobs, she said. I work part-time at a marketing company. What company? Rachel named another CIA front business. If Detective Wilson called to check, someone would answer the phone and confirm she worked there. But she was starting to worry about how many threads of her cover identity were being pulled at once. That's when she noticed the man from across the street was now standing just 20 feet away, watching the whole scene with intense interest. He was talking on his phone and occasionally pointing in her direction. The crowd around Rachel and the two police officers was getting louder and more restless. What had started as a few curious onlookers had turned into a group of about 30 people, many with their phones out, recording everything that was happening. "This is wrong," a young woman shouted from the sidewalk. "She's been nothing but polite and cooperative. Let her go," an older man added. "All she did was take some pictures of buildings." Detective Wilson tried to ignore the growing crowd, but it was becoming impossible. Every time he moved, someone would shout something about police harassment or excessive force. The situation was getting out of hand, and he knew it. Officer Hayes looked nervous. "Maybe we should call for backup," he suggested quietly. "Already on the way," Detective Wilson replied, speaking into his radio to request additional units. Rachel watched this exchange with growing worry. More police meant more attention, more questions, and more chances for someone to discover equipment that would be impossible to explain. She needed to find a way to end this situation quickly, but without seeming too eager to leave. The man who had been watching from across the street was now standing close enough that Rachel could hear parts of his phone conversation. He was speaking in what sounded like Arabic, and she caught a few words that made her blood run cold. He was talking about the American woman, the police, and something about pictures. Rachel realized she might be in even more danger than she'd thought. If that man was connected to the people she'd been photographing, and if he suspected what she was really doing, this could turn into a much more serious situation than just a police search. "Step over here." "Please," Detective Wilson said, gesturing toward the wall of the nearest building. "We need to do a more thorough search." "A more thorough search?" Rachel asked. "You've already been through my bag. What else do you need to see?" "Just routine procedure, ma'am. When someone's carrying items that seem inconsistent with their stated identity, we have to be careful." The crowd erupted at this. People started shouting about racial profiling and discrimination. Someone yelled, "She's being targeted because she's black." Another person screamed, "This is harassment." Rachel found herself in an impossible position. She couldn't let the police search her more thoroughly, without risking exposure of equipment that would definitely blow her cover. But she also couldn't resist too strongly without looking guilty and making things worse. "I don't consent to any further searches," she said firmly but politely. "I've answered all your questions and shown you everything in my bag. I haven't done anything illegal." "Ma'am, we have reasonable suspicion that," Detective Wilson started to explain. "Reasonable suspicion of what?" the young woman in the crowd interrupted. "Taking pictures in public?" "That's not illegal." Phone cameras were everywhere now, capturing every word and gesture. Rachel knew that within hours this confrontation would be all over social media. The last thing the CIA needed was their undercover agent becoming the star of a viral video about police misconduct. Officer Hayes approached from the side. "Ma'am, if you could just put your hands against the wall, we can get this sorted out quickly." "I'm not putting my hands anywhere," Rachel said. "I haven't committed a crime, and I don't have to submit to a search just because you think my makeup is too expensive." 2 more police cars pulled up with their lights flashing. 4 additional officers got out and started trying to control the crowd, which had grown to nearly 50 people. The sidewalk was packed and traffic was slowing down as drivers tried to see what was happening. One of the new officers, a sergeant with 20 years of experience, quickly assessed the situation. He could see this was turning into a public relations nightmare for the department. Videos of police searching a cooperative woman's purse while an angry crowd shouted about racism were exactly the kind of thing that ended up on the evening news. "What's the situation here?" Sergeant Rodriguez asked Detective Wilson. "Got a call about suspicious photography. Found some items that don't match her story." Sergeant Rodriguez looked at Rachel. then at the items spread across the car hood, then at the crowd of people with their phones out. He'd been a cop long enough to know when a situation was about to go very bad for everyone involved. "What kind of items?" he asked. Detective Wilson showed him the electronic device and the vial of liquid. "Claims it's a speaker, but it doesn't have normal controls. Says this is anxiety medication, but there's no prescription label." Rachel could see Sergeant Rodriguez trying to decide if this was worth the potential fallout. The crowd was getting more aggressive, and the videos being recorded would probably be online within the hour. "Ma'am," Sergeant Rodriguez said to Rachel, "we'd like to ask you a few more questions. Would you be willing to come with us to the station?" "Am I under arrest?" Rachel asked. "Not at this time. We'd just like to clear up some confusion." "Then no, I won't come with you. I'm waiting for my ride and I haven't done anything wrong." The crowd cheered at her response. Someone shouted, "You tell them, sister." Another person yelled, "Know your rights." That's when Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her stomach drop. It was from her CIA handler. "Situation compromised. Extract immediately." Someone had been monitoring police radio chatter or social media and realized that a CIA asset was in trouble. The message meant that Rachel needed to get out of this situation right now before it got any worse. But how could she leave without making it obvious she was running? And how could she retrieve her equipment without raising more suspicions? The man who had been watching from across the street was now talking to one of the newly arrived police officers. Rachel couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see him pointing at her and gesturing toward the building where she'd taken photographs. Officer Hayes picked up the small electronic device again. "I'm going to try something," he said to his sergeant. He pressed and held what looked like it might be a power button. Rachel's heart nearly stopped. If that device activated, it might start scanning for electronic signals or making sounds that would be impossible to explain. The CIA's tech people had designed it to look like consumer electronics, but it wasn't meant to fool trained investigators who had time to examine it closely. Nothing happened when Officer Hayes pressed the button, which was actually worse than if something had happened. A real speaker would have made some kind of sound or shown some kind of light. "See?" Detective Wilson said. "It's not what she says it is." The crowd was getting more hostile by the minute. People were shouting that this had gone on long enough, that the police were harassing an innocent woman, that this was a clear case of racial profiling. Some were calling for the officers' badge numbers and talking about filing complaints. Rachel realized she had to make a decision fast. She could continue trying to maintain her cover and hope that the situation resolved itself, or she could take more drastic action to protect the operation she'd been working on for months. Her phone buzzed again with another message from her handler. "Abort mission. Protect assets. Help incoming. Help incoming." That meant the CIA was already working to get her out of this situation, probably through official channels. But it also meant that her cover was about to be blown in a very public way, with dozens of witnesses recording everything. Detective Wilson was examining the vial of liquid again, holding it up to the light and shaking it slightly. "This doesn't look like any medication I've ever seen." "That's because you're not a doctor," Rachel snapped, finally letting some real frustration show through her calm exterior. "Maybe we should have it tested," Officer Hayes suggested. "You can't test someone's medication without a warrant," Rachel said quickly. She was right about that. But she also knew that if anyone tested that liquid, they would discover it was definitely not anxiety medication. Sergeant Rodriguez was looking more and more unhappy about the whole situation. The crowd was bordering on hostile. The media attention was going to be terrible. And they still didn't have any real evidence that this woman had committed a crime. But Detective Wilson wasn't ready to give up. Something about Rachel's behavior, her equipment, and her two perfect answers was bothering him. In 15 years of police work, he'd developed good instincts about when people were hiding something important. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Is there anything you want to tell us about what you were really doing here today?" Rachel stared at Detective Wilson for a long moment, weighing her options. The crowd behind him was getting more agitated by the second. Phone cameras were still recording everything. The man from across the street was now talking to two different police officers, and Rachel could see them occasionally glancing in her direction. "I've told you everything," she said finally. "I'm a student. I was taking pictures of buildings, and I was waiting for my ride when you decided to harass me." Detective Wilson's jaw tightened. He'd been a cop for 15 years, and he knew when someone was lying to him. Everything about this woman felt wrong. Her answers were too smooth, her equipment was too expensive, and her behavior was too calm for someone being searched by police. "Run her ID again," he told Officer Hayes. "Check for any federal databases, immigration records, anything unusual." Rachel felt a spike of panic. Her cover identity was good, but if they dug deep enough into federal databases, they might find traces that would raise questions she couldn't answer. That's when she made a calculated decision. She discreetly touched a spot on her phone case that looked like a small scratch but was actually a button. It sent a coded distress signal to her CIA handler, letting them know she was in immediate danger and needed emergency extraction. Within 3 minutes, that signal would reach a crisis center where analysts would start making phone calls to local FBI offices, police departments, and anyone else who could help resolve the situation without blowing her cover completely. But 3 minutes might be too long. Sergeant Rodriguez was trying to calm down the crowd, but people were getting more upset as time went on. "This has been going on for almost half an hour," a woman shouted. "Either arrest her or let her go. She hasn't done anything wrong." Another person yelled, "You're just harassing her because of how she looks." The accusations of racial profiling were getting louder and more frequent. Rachel could see that some of the officers were getting defensive about it, which was making the whole situation more tense. Officer Hayes came back from running her ID through additional databases. "Everything checks out clean," he reported to Detective Wilson. "No warrants, no criminal history, address is confirmed residential." But Detective Wilson wasn't satisfied. He picked up the small electronic device again and turned it over in his hands. "This thing bothers me. It's too heavy to be a cheap speaker, but it doesn't have any of the features you'd expect from an expensive one." Rachel watched nervously as he continued examining it. The CIA's tech people had done their best to make it look like consumer electronics, but they'd prioritized function over perfect disguise. If Detective Wilson knew what to look for, he might figure out it was something more sophisticated than a speaker. "Let me see your phone," Detective Wilson said suddenly. "Why? If this connects to your phone through Bluetooth, it should show up in your device list." Rachel's mind raced. Her phone did have Bluetooth, but the listening device didn't actually connect that way. It had its own sophisticated communication system that couldn't be easily detected or traced. "My Bluetooth is turned off to save battery," she said. "Turn it on." Rachel hesitated. "I don't think you have the right to search my phone." "I'm not searching it. I just want you to show me your Bluetooth settings." The crowd erupted again. "She doesn't have to show you anything else," someone shouted. "This is a fishing expedition." But Rachel could see that refusing would make her look even more suspicious. With shaking hands, she turned on her Bluetooth and showed Detective Wilson the screen. The listening device didn't appear in the list of available devices, which made her story about it being a speaker look like a lie. "Interesting," Detective Wilson said. "Your speaker isn't showing up." "Sometimes it takes a while," Rachel said weakly. That's when the man from across the street approached Sergeant Rodriguez directly. "Officer," he said in accented English, "I think I should tell you something about this woman." Rachel's blood went cold. This was what she'd been afraid of from the beginning. "She was taking pictures of our building," the man continued. "Pictures of specific people going in and out. We are business owners and we were concerned about corporate espionage." Sergeant Rodriguez looked at Rachel with new suspicion. "Is that true, ma'am?" "I was taking pictures of the building architecture," Rachel insisted. "If people happen to be in the background, that's not illegal." "Show us the pictures," Detective Wilson demanded. Rachel's phone had dozens of photos on it, including several that clearly showed the 3 men she'd been surveilling. Those photos, combined with the sophisticated equipment in her bag, would be impossible to explain away. "I don't have to show you anything else," she said. "I want a lawyer." The crowd cheered, but Rachel could see she was running out of options. Asking for a lawyer made her look guilty, but showing the photos would definitely blow her cover. Detective Wilson was about to respond when his radio crackled with an urgent message. "Detective Wilson, you have a priority call from federal law enforcement. Please respond immediately." Wilson looked confused. "Federal law enforcement? FBI wants to speak with you regarding your current situation. Please call the number I'm about to give you." Rachel felt a wave of relief. Her distress signal had worked. The CIA had contacted the FBI, who were now reaching out to local police to resolve the situation. But Detective Wilson wasn't ready to let this go. "Ma'am, I'm going to place you under arrest pending further investigation." "On what charges?" Rachel demanded. "Suspicious activity, possible corporate espionage, carrying unidentified substances." The crowd exploded with anger. People started shouting that this was an outrage, that she was being arrested for being black and taking photos in public. Someone yelled about calling the news stations. Rachel knew she was out of time. In a few minutes, she'd be in handcuffs and on her way to a police station where her fingerprints and DNA would be taken. Even if the FBI sorted this out eventually, her undercover identity would be completely blown. Officer Hayes started to approach her with handcuffs, but Sergeant Rodriguez held up a hand to stop him. "Wait," he said. "Let me take this call first." He walked a few steps away and dialed the number the dispatcher had given him. Rachel could only hear fragments of the conversation, but she caught enough to understand what was happening. "Yes, this is Sergeant Rodriguez. Yes, we have her here. I understand. Federal matter? How do I verify that? Okay, I'll wait for them to arrive." When he hung up, Sergeant Rodriguez looked troubled. He walked back to Detective Wilson and spoke quietly in his ear. Rachel couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could see Wilson's expression change from determination to confusion to concern. "What's going on?" Officer Hayes asked. "We're going to wait here for some federal agents to arrive," Sergeant Rodriguez announced. "Nobody's under arrest for now." The crowd quieted down slightly, confused by this development. Rachel tried to look as puzzled as everyone else, but inside she was calculating how much longer she could maintain her cover. Detective Wilson was staring at her with a mix of suspicion and something else. Maybe respect, maybe worry. "Ma'am," he said, "is there anything you want to tell us before these agents arrive?" Rachel met his eyes steadily. "I've told you everything. I'm just a student who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." But even as she said it, she could see in Detective Wilson's expression that he knew she was much more than that. The question was whether he'd figure out exactly what before the cavalry arrived to extract her from this mess. 20 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up to the scene. Rachel watched as a tall man in a dark suit got out and walked directly toward Sergeant Rodriguez. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from having authority that local police officers had to respect. The crowd had grown even larger while they waited. News of the confrontation had spread on social media, and people were still arriving to watch what was happening. Some had started chanting about police accountability. Others were live-streaming the whole thing on their phones. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the man in the suit asked, showing his credentials. "I'm Special Agent Foster with the FBI. I understand you have someone here I need to speak with." Rachel couldn't hear the conversation between Agent Foster and Sergeant Rodriguez, but she could see the police sergeant's body language change. He went from suspicious and defensive to uncomfortable and apologetic in the span of about 2 minutes. Detective Wilson wasn't giving up easily, though. Rachel watched him approach Agent Foster and start explaining about the suspicious equipment, the conflicting stories, and his concerns about what she'd really been doing in the area. Agent Foster listened patiently, occasionally nodding or asking quiet questions. Then he looked directly at Rachel for the first time. Their eyes met across the crowd of onlookers and police officers, and Rachel saw something there that made her think this man knew exactly who she was and what kind of situation they were all dealing with. "Detective Wilson," Agent Foster said loudly enough for Rachel to hear, "I appreciate your thoroughness and your dedication to keeping the community safe. However, Ms. Turner is involved in a federal matter that I'm not at liberty to discuss in detail." "What kind of federal matter?" Detective Wilson asked. "The kind that requires you to return her property and allow her to leave with me immediately." Detective Wilson looked like he wanted to argue, but Sergeant Rodriguez put a hand on his arm. "Pack up her things," Rodriguez ordered Officer Hayes. The crowd started murmuring as they realized the situation was taking another unexpected turn. Some people seemed disappointed that there wouldn't be an arrest. Others were satisfied that the woman was being released. But everyone was curious about why the FBI had gotten involved. Officer Hayes began putting Rachel's equipment back into her handbag. He handled each item carefully now, as if he suddenly realized they might be more important than he'd originally thought. The listening device, the disguised camera, the vial of liquid. Everything went back into the bag without further questions. Rachel walked over to collect her belongings, trying to look relieved but not too eager. "Thank you," she said to Agent Foster. "Ma'am," Agent Foster replied formally. "If you'd come with me, please." But Detective Wilson wasn't finished. "Agent Foster, I have concerns about what this woman was doing in this area. We received reports of surveillance activity, and her equipment and behavior raised multiple red flags." Agent Foster turned to face Detective Wilson directly. "Detective, I understand your concerns, but Ms. Turner was engaged in authorized federal activity. The surveillance you're worried about was legitimate and necessary for national security purposes." National security. Those words hung in the air and changed everything. The crowd got quieter. The police officers looked at each other with new understanding. Even Detective Wilson seemed to realize he'd stumbled into something much bigger than he'd expected. "She's a federal agent?" Officer Hayes asked quietly. Agent Foster didn't answer directly. "She's someone who was doing her job, and your interference nearly compromised an important operation." Rachel could see the moment when Detective Wilson put all the pieces together. The expensive equipment, the smooth answers, the calm behavior under pressure, the federal intervention. It all made sense now. "I was just doing my job too," Detective Wilson said defensively. "I know you were," Agent Foster replied, "and normally I'd commend you for your attention to detail. But in this case, that attention nearly caused some serious problems." Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward. "What do we tell the crowd? And the media? This is going to be all over the news." Agent Foster looked around at the 50 or so people still watching and recording everything. Rachel realized this was probably the part of the situation that worried the CIA the most. Videos of their undercover agents being searched by local police were exactly the kind of thing that could blow multiple operations and put lives at risk. "The official story," Agent Foster said clearly, "is that Ms. Turner was conducting legitimate federal business and that this was all a misunderstanding. The local police acted appropriately based on the information they had, and federal authorities resolved the situation through proper channels." He turned to address the crowd directly. "The show's over, folks. Everything has been resolved peacefully. I'd appreciate it if everyone could disperse and let us finish our business here." Most people started to drift away, but some were still filming and asking questions. "What federal agency?" someone shouted. "What kind of business?" Agent Foster ignored the questions and guided Rachel toward his car. As they walked, he spoke quietly so only she could hear. "Your cover is blown locally, but we might be able to contain the damage. The good news is that most people will assume you're FBI rather than CIA, which is better for operational security." "What about the photos I took?" Rachel asked. "The men from the building? Already being handled. We had teams move in while the police were detaining you. Sometimes a distraction can be useful even when it's not planned." Rachel felt a mix of relief and frustration. Her mission had been compromised, but maybe the overall operation hadn't been a complete loss. As they reached Agent Foster's car, Detective Wilson approached one last time. "Ma'am," he said to Rachel, "I want you to know that I was just trying to do my job. Nothing personal." Rachel looked at him for a moment. Despite everything that had happened, she could respect that. He'd been thorough, persistent, and professional. In other circumstances, those were exactly the qualities you'd want in a police officer. "I understand," she said. "You were protecting your community. I can respect that." Detective Wilson nodded and stepped back. Rachel got into the passenger seat of Agent Foster's car, and they drove away from the scene. As they left, Rachel could see some people in the crowd were still filming, still talking about what they'd witnessed. By evening, there would probably be dozens of videos online with titles like "Woman Searched by Police Turns Out to be Federal Agent" and "FBI Intervenes in Police Stop." "How bad is this for my career?" Rachel asked as they drove. Agent Foster was quiet for a moment. "Your undercover days in this city are probably over. Too many people saw your face today, and some of them will remember it. But there are other cities, other operations. What about the men I was watching? We got enough from your preliminary photos to identify them. Combined with the bank account information you collected earlier, we have what we need to move forward with the investigation." Rachel leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. 8 years of careful work building her cover identity, and it had been blown by a random police stop and some overly observant officers. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened in her line of work. and it probably wouldn't be the last. There is one positive outcome from all this, Agent Foster added. What's that? Detective Wilson. He's got good instincts and attention to detail. We might want to approach him about working with federal task forces in the future. Rachel almost smiled at that. The man who had nearly destroyed her operation might end up becoming an asset for future operations. In the intelligence world, things had a way of coming full circle in unexpected ways. As they drove toward the federal building where Rachel would spend the next several hours being debriefed about everything that had happened, she reflected on how quickly a routine day could turn into a career-changing event. One moment she was a graduate student taking architectural photos, and the next she was a blown CIA asset being extracted by the FBI. But that was the nature of the work. Every day brought new risks, new challenges, and new reminders that in the world of intelligence, nothing ever went exactly according to plan.